I realize that's backwards. That's the Sayings Gospel of Thomas. I also have a book here that contains the Apocryphon of James and the secret, the secret book of John, or the Apocryphon of John, and Pistis Sophia, and all that kind of stuff. Now, it's very strange, people. This is a lesson on Gnosticism, and I'm going to go through what it is, and the terminology: Gnosis, Sophia, Logos, Demiurge, the Monad, Barbello, the Aeons, the Emanations, and the Archons. People talk about Gnosticism. Really, people really got into it with Dan Brown, and Dan Brown described a faction of the Ebionites, which were not Gnostic, or a Judaized faction, when he talked about the Gnostics, because if you've read the Da Vinci Code, the description of the Gnostics in there, you could not get farther away from what the Gnostics actually practiced. And this is why monasteries were very suspect for the first 300 years. The idea of monasteries, because what do you think harbored all the Gnostics? There's the monasteries in the desert. All right, so let's get into this now. Christians like to say that Gnosticism predated Christianity, and yeah, some of these ideas predated Christianity, but I'm afraid that me and other scholars put the blame on one guy, and that's Paul. And it wasn't Paul's fault necessarily, and it might have not even been authentic Paul. There's 7 authentic Pauline epistles, and then there's the pseudo Pauline stuff, and then there's what people call anti-Pauline, which is the pastoral epistles: 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus. Again, I'm coming from this at a scholarly, secular view. All right, because people watch my other videos and they go, "Wait, so you don't believe in a God?" When I'm addressing history and facts, I don't. Faith is not part of the equation, right? I'm just trying to convey facts, right? Being impartial. And I can do that as Orthodox. The evangelicals and the Protestants don't seem to be able to do that. Well, the liberals can, but even authentic Paul, second letter of Paul to the Corinthians. Check out what he says. Tell me if this doesn't sound like the Demiurge or the Archons, and I'll describe them after I read this. All right, it says, in chapter 3, verse 13. And are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away, but their minds were hardened. For until this very day they were reading the Old Covenant, and the veil remains unlifted because it was removed by Christ. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Yikes. And then, there's the popular thing about thrones, dominions, all these powers in heaven. So let's go through it. What did the Gnostics believe, right? You had three major groups. You had the Judaizers, remembered as Ebionites, Alkazites, Nasrenes, who were the Judaizers, basically. They believed that Jesus was a Jewish Messiah. Some of them didn't believe in the virgin birth. Some of them did. Um, the Gospel of Matthew was used by the Ebionites, or at least a version of it was, um, and has a lot of Ebionite or Judaizing thinking in there. And the Ebionites were known because they were called the poor ones, because you had to give up your possessions and be poor, right? And at least abide by the Jewish laws, right? And this, historians think this came out of James's church, which was at odds with Paul's church, right? But it, it we hear usually from the enemies, um, and very few of the Judaizing writings still exist to this day. But the Gnostics were on the other extreme, right? The Gnostics, um, a lot of them were the Docete. Now, some of them believe that Christ, because, okay, from the beginning, the Demiurge, in the beginning there was God, the monad, the one. And from him emanated the Logos and Sophia. Sophia meaning wisdom. Logos is word, but check out Andrew's channel. He trying to explain what Logos means. It's a whole concept. And you had these emanations of kind of like light descending from the pure light, until you get down to a being that is so stupid or malevolent that thinks he is actually God. And he does the worst thing that any of these spirit beings can do. He creates the physical universe. And then he thinks he's God. And he is the God of the Jews. He's a jealous God. He's angry. He's not a God of spirit. He's this hardcore, you know. So that's the Demiurge. And there's also Archons, like these angels that rule over different areas. And the Demiurge is kind of like the highest Archon, but there's other ones beneath him. Kind of like what people would think of demons, but these are actually more powerful. They're like other gods. It's as if you had the Jewish God was the highest God, right? False God. And like all the other gods, like the Aztec gods and the Illuminati gods, were like archons because they were over their different countries. There were 72 of them for the 72 nations of the earth. So you had these archons that were ruling over the earth, and but the Gnostics believed that Christ came and gave this wisdom, and they believed one of two things: either that when Jesus was baptized, the Christ came, the Logos came into him, and then he was the Christ from then on until before his crucifixion, the Logos left him, and then he was executed, and then he returned, and after the death, and still had the appearance. But most of them believe that, kind of like Marcion, that he didn't have a flesh body at all. Why? Because the Gnostics believed that the physical world was evil. And anything tying you to nature was evil. There's no beauty in nature. and anything tying you to the physical world was wrong, was bad. It was you. The worst thing, by the way, was sex, especially romantic love, because you're falling in love with this other being that's not God, right? And you're enjoying carnality, right? And from that produces children. So they're pulling um, souls out of the pleroma. The pleroma is the fullness, um, that this like sea of light kind of thing, that where the monad is. I should probably write that one down. Pleroma. Uh, all these words can be found in the New Testament, by the way. I don't think demiurge or monad can be found in there, but certainly archon, gnosis, sophia, logos, and pleroma. So the Gnostics were celibate men, um, no sex, no children, and no women. You'll find that out, especially no women. So at the end of the Gospel of Thomas, said, "Well, how can Mary Magdalene become a how could she be saved? She's a woman." And Christ says, "Well, I will turn her male, or I'll turn her into a man." And people try to get around that, saying that's not really what he meant. Well, as if trying to exonerate the Gnostics from their own beliefs. Pretty weird. So it was only celibate men, and monasteries. Gnosticism thrived in the monasteries, right? Because these were men not having sex, that were alone, that were reading, that were trying to gain knowledge, because gnosis meant knowledge. No, it wasn't necessarily secret knowledge, although they did keep books that had secret knowledge in there. And they would write these texts like, yeah, we know, because they would have the New Testament, right? They would have, they knew it existed, and they would actually write, yes, we know that's what Christ told these apostles, but it was actually Paul who got the true message because he spoke to the resurrected Christ. And the other apostles were deceived because they were speaking to the man in the flesh, right? And then others said, oh, like the Apocryphon of James, or is it John, begins with, um, Jesus pulled me aside and told me all these secrets and told me not to tell anybody. So this is why none of the apostles know and nobody else knows. And these documents show up 150 years later. Oh, look, see, John or James or so-and-so, even though James led a pretty Judaized community, why would he be a Gnostic? You know, see, this is the real way to get into heaven. You know, you had the Sethians, the Ophites, the Valentinians. Valentinus might as well have been a disciple of Paul, and got Paul wrong, because Paul constantly talks about the flesh being bad and the spirit being good. But you can kind of tell he's not talking about actually all flesh being evil, and he actually allows for sex and marriage, even in authentic Paul, not in just the pastoral epistles, which really champion childbirth and family and everything like that. But Christ was not the God who created the universe or the world, nor was his Father or the Holy Spirit. These were alien gods. These were gods that were above the terrible God that created nature and human beings and sex and flesh, and because they saw it as birth, sex, death, you know, and sex begets life, human life, physical life, natural life, which is just going to die, but has the urge to have sex. And this is the hell that the Demiurge created. So sex was the worst thing, And to be attached to the world was the worst thing. You needed to escape from this. It was escaping um, the world. So worldly pleasures were just, it's kind of like the Matrix. Um, so you know, lust and sex, that's why that was the worst thing. Especially uh, women, they bore children, and when men were around women, they would fall in love with them, and then they'd be pulling souls out of the Pleroma and trapping them in flesh bodies, right? And they had these secret knowledge to get away from this and go back to God, the true God, the monad, going into pure light, um, because Christ didn't have a flesh body. And there were these aeons, which aeons also, it means age, but it also can mean realm. So, like, you'll see these diagrams of the Ophites. Um, this is just a kind of brief overview. I'll actually do a second part where I'll go through the works of Paul and show you where, if you read Paul, remember, the works of the New Testament were written by multiple different people, different places. So if you only had a few works of Paul, you really could see how somebody would embrace this form of belief. And I think it was Paul's fault. Well, not really Paul's fault, but his writing and the way he wrote and how bombastic he was. If people just had a few of his works, yeah, it would be real. Oh yeah, Gnosticism. That sounds, that's, then you had so many branches of Gnosticism, and it's not like you were either Gnostic or you were part of the church or you were a Judaizer. The Gnostics were inside the church. They were in the monasteries, and their books were kept. I mean, most of all of the Gnostic writings we have been found in monasteries, not just Nag Hammadi. And remember, Nag Hammadi, that came from a monastery. But the rest of the Gnostic works have been found in current monasteries to this day, and they were just very old works were found that just weren't read anymore. All right, peace to you. I'll do a part two, and you'll see where Paul it's pretty yeah, I'll get into it. I hope I don't sway anybody into swearing off sex, women, and children, and joining a monastery and becoming a Gnostic.